If it's not a machine, then this is the way it has to work. And the meaning of worship, as I said earlier, is to contribute our lives to that process of the intensification of the cosmic adventure, and recognizing that this cannot be done all by ourselves, but we have to be inspired by, Whitehead calls them eternal objects, which is his word for Platonic forms, possibilities, in other words, that are presented to us in the concrete fabric and weave of our day-to-day lives. And the meaning of sin and evil, so what you mentioned before, is to decide, no, I'm not going to go along with that adventurous process. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in tearing myself off from the full fabric of this organism and placing myself aside from that individualistically. But remember, in process thought is relational at its core, so that to be, and certainly to be more, and certainly to contribute to the intensification of beauty, requires the intensification of human relationships. So there's a whole new kind of spirituality that's very relational and social that goes along with suggestions of process thought. The meaning of redemption, from a theological point of view, Whitehead's thought has been so appealing pastorally to so many people because it allows for a kind of intimate redemption of the world by God that doesn't seem to be conceptualized in the same way in traditional forms of theism. And that's that God redeems the world since God is relational too, remaining consistent with the vocabulary and the categories of process philosophy. God is the most intense instantiation of feeling. So we have a suffering God, but not a suffering God whose transcendence is in any way jeopardized by the fact that God suffers with the world, but a kind of intensification of a kind of redemption in which God's suffering and feeling of the world actually becomes more intensified over time. And that's the mark of perfection in a process world. Perfection is not changelessness as it is in the Platonic world, and which is still very much stuck in the craw of a lot of contemporary theology, Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox. But I forgot the first half of that sentence. But anyway, redemption means God's feeling the totality of events that make up the cosmic process. And in that process, God is changed. God becomes even more intensely compassionate. So God can change, but not in a way that diminishes the perfection of God in any way. A process theologian named Schubert Ogden has formulated what he calls a neoclassical theology of theism, in which all the traditional attributes of God are maintained. God's immutability, God's eternity, God's absoluteness, God's impassibility, God's unchanging or immutability, but in a different way, not as stony immobility, changelessness, but in such a way as God's immutability consists of God's being unchangingly compassionate, unchangingly feeling. God's eternity consists of God's being everlastingly involved in the temporal process of the universe. So redemption, to make a long story short, means God's taking not just my life, not just your life, not just my soul and your souls, not harvesting souls from the universe, but taking the whole cosmic process, the whole perishable series of events that's made up this universe, and saving them everlastingly in the compassionate, suffering, feeling, love of God, so that nothing is ever lost. Even though it's lost to us, nothing is ever lost to God. So that's what redemption means. And this is how I started off by saying Whitehead was trying, I think, to try to find a worldview that could support the passionate need on the part of humans to believe that perishing is not absolute. It's not final. That something endures everlastingly, that everything endures everlastingly in the feelings, the mind of God. So, yes, in a sense, God does change. If perfection is not static being, but becoming, then God's perfection consists of God's changing, but in such a way that God's changing preserves traditional ideas about God, and especially the biblical idea of God, whom Whitehead sums up in his expression, God is the fellow sufferer who understands. So you can see then why Joe Bracken and others think that this schematization allows a framework to understand Christology and soteriology, Christian understanding of Christ as God's compassion. Monica Helwig has a book entitled Christ or Jesus, the Compassion of God. What process theology tries to do, whether successfully or not, you'll have to decide when you go back and read Joe Bracken's book. But whether right or not, what process thought is trying to do is to make a place for God's, not only God's everlastingness, but God's compassion as well. Well, there's much more to be said, but I hope this gives you some sense of what process thought is trying to do. And Joe Bracken is trying to add his 2 cents worth to this. So we have time for...
Sure, I don't, what time is it?
The clock is gone.
I have 8:22.
I have 8:22.
8:22.
Yeah, we meet